I'm going to introduce my research that took place in Izmir, Turkey. This is a picture of lovely Izmir, right on the Aegean. And I did research in 2 neighborhoods in Izmir. There are about 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey and about 100,000 in Izmir. This took place in 2017 to 2018, and I used engaged ethnography, or grounded theory, which means that I went into the field without a hypothesis about what I would find, and my questions and my answers developed through the field work itself, through work with Syrian refugees. I interviewed approximately 50 men and 50 women, mostly from northern Syria. My study focused on 2 groups. So with the folks that I met through humanitarian networks, first I met former humanitarian staff and translators and Syrian teachers, so more middle-class professionals. And then I started to meet the beneficiaries of aid programs that they had worked with, who were mostly Syrians who worked in the informal labor economy in Turkey, who are less educated without a BA. And some had agricultural backgrounds and others had had small businesses in Syria. So for today's talk, I'm talking about that second group who worked in the informal labor economy. And as I was putting together kind of 2 areas from my dissertation that hadn't fully been put together in one chapter before, I noticed that the gender binaries were really important to talk about here. So what happened when I started writing more about men working and women receiving health care, right? We have this interesting parallel that I want to explain a little bit before I go into the data. So part of the reason for this binary that came up in my research was that Syrians strongly adhered to gender binaries. All of the women I interviewed were wearing hijab. These were mostly families where, like historically in Syria, men would work and women would stay home and raise children. So that's the cultural context that I'm talking about. So what came up was women's bodies, health and reproductive care. And on the other hand, men's bodies, labor, exhaustion, and injury. So why? 95% of Syrians in Turkey work in the unregulated labor sector. So very small amounts of Syrians are getting work permits to do more professional roles. Some Syrian women worked at home in cases where they were sewing beads onto dresses or cutting the threads from fabric from the textile industry. This is work that they would take from Turkish employers and then send back. And then on the other side of kind of bringing some complexity to this binary, some Syrian men were seeking health care as well, but it didn't come up as a major issue, except in a case where someone was turned away for not able to get fertility treatment when he was found to be infertile. And sorry, my voice. And a lot of men were seeking care for injuries and disability from war and labor. So I'm going to talk about theory here for a minute. And one of the things that came up when I got to the field was how there were many narratives of danger that were coming up. And I took some time to situate them in relation to some different literature. So one of the questions that Yael Navarro raised in her work with refugees in Turkey was what resonates as affect in the different geographies that we study as anthropologists, and what can be learned from these other evocations of affect, as well as their different ways of being understood in their specific historical conjunctures. Would it be pertinent to study these as ontologies of affect? So attunement to affect was really important for being really engaged through the study. I also have benefited from Linda Green's work in thinking about how fear thrives on ambiguities. And fear is also part of the way that I think about narratives of danger. And in terms of narratives of danger and a related category, which is trauma, I really like the way that Anne Spekovich frames it as a name for experiences of socially situated political violence that forges overt connections between politics and emotion. So I'm really trying to understand how narratives of danger that come up through this study of gender and the impacts of migration, why are they important politically? What can they show us about violence that we wouldn't know otherwise? These are some of the literatures that I draw on in my broader dissertation. I won't talk about all of these themes today, but I just wanted to give you a sense. So I situate Syrian narratives of fear and danger. I try to understand violence and constructions of race in Turkey related to Arabs and Syrians. I engage with biopolitics and necropolitics and critiques of humanitarianism. So this is the question that I'm addressing today. What are the gendered impacts of migration, and what do they tell us about the ways in which Syrians understand their challenges to survival? And what do they tell us about the normalization of violence on a broader level? And throughout my dissertation, I engage with the politics of care, and I define that through the different kinds of services that Syrians receive. So here we have aid, ample access to unregulated labor, healthcare, and education. And I'm going to come back to this picture. This kind of labor represents working, collecting things like scrapyard metal or cardboard, which is a form of labor that many men undertook when they were fed up with the unregulated labor sector. So this was a kind of way of working on their own terms after having not been paid or suffering various forms of injury in the workplace. So I'll come back to that. So it's important to note, if anyone is familiar with the context, that Syrians arrived in Turkey alongside through these discourses of hospitality from the ruling party, the AK party. And so it's kind of, so this hospitality is increasingly at odds with public sphere discourses in Turkey that a lot of scholars have noted recently, which have been animated by opposition party politics. An issue that is really important to understanding for the Syrian experience in Turkey is that it's greatly impacted through the Turkey-EU agreement. So this was an agreement in 2016 where Turkey agreed to secure the borders around the Mija to prevent migration. If you remember from 2015, 1 million refugees fled on rubber rafts from basically Izmir to Greece, right? And so Turkey agreed to, protect refugees by preventing them from doing this, by securing those borders in exchange for visa-free travel for Turkish citizens to the EU. So that's one important thing to know. The other thing to know is that Turkey signed the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees, which means, with the caveat that Turkey only accepts refugees from Europe. So Syrians are not considered refugees in Turkey. They're under temporary protection, which can be revoked at any time. So first I'm going to talk about gendered impacts in terms of women's health care. In my research, doctors' offices and hospitals were places where violence occurs, according to Syrians that I interviewed. So some of the forms of care afforded to Syrians are spaces where they feel that violence was normalized by others. And Iman said, or Tasneem said, this is a narrative about when she went to give birth in a Turkish hospital. It was very cold in the hospital. The doctors had beaten me for yelling in pain after they tried to force open my birth opening. After they birthed, they threw my baby in my face and said, "We don't need any more babies from Syria." Tasneem, age 18, from Aleppo. So this is one example of the way that Syrian women were reporting forms of violence. But it also came through the public sphere, through neighbors, and Syrians were making connections between these two kinds of experiences. So Iman said, "The Turks are talking a lot about pregnant women. Oh, she comes to Turkey and she's pregnant. Yeah, what's the problem with it? I can't stop my life for 5 or 7 years just waiting for this war to finish." Iman, age 24, from Aleppo. So, as I said, Syrians were making connections between bias that they experienced in the public sphere and from neighbors, and also in medical contexts. And sometimes these coalesced into a kind of trope of, oh, Turkish people don't like us because we're Syrian. And at other times it coalesced into an imaginary of danger based in fear, based on a kind of recent social memory of collective Syrian experiences of living in Turkey. And this is important because the different sectors of governance, if you think about healthcare, education, labor, are governed by different ministries in Turkey. And the political influences are difficult to piece apart. But what's clear is that the AK party, Erdogan's party, is definitely setting the policy. But what Syrians are getting out of that is not this overview of policy, right? They're getting this daily interaction of bias, which makes them think that there is a massive scale of racism happening at times. Here's another example. Sometimes the neighbors will bring us clothes for my baby, but then they will try to explain to us, you don't need to make more babies. Go to the doctor and get birth control. So women are getting these messages from their neighbors. And I read this as a form of anti-natalism. If any of you remember Zeynep Korkmaz's work, she talked about the blessings of abundance through bereket when in 2008 President Erdogan said that every woman in Turkey should have at least 3 children. And he very much demonized abortion, cesarean birth, and birth control. He called birth control treason. And he said rejecting motherhood means giving up humanity. But counter to that, Syrian women that I interviewed feared being pressured into using birth control and feared forced sterilization. And Syrian women who sought short-term birth control were offered long-term solutions. And so one of the, Soraya, who was a Syrian translator for the Sahat program, which is a new program rolled out last year to train Syrians to be medical translators, which would help communication and these misunderstandings in medical contexts. But what she found was that after she started doing this work, bias still continued. And she actually became so frustrated that she quit her job. But hopefully it's not the case everywhere. But this is what she told me. Everything is good for the healthcare of refugees, amazing, but without any respect or mercy. The doctor's assistant said to a Syrian patient, "You are very filthy, you and your children really need a shower." And then another doctor complained about that, and it actually resulted in a legal case. Ayman told me, now Syrian women are getting injections to not get pregnant for periods of 3 months or 6 months or more. I prefer to use birth control the normal way until my baby is 2, and then we plan to have another baby. So when women are pressured into this, and if that's not what they want, they're taking things into their own hands. And another issue that came up was underage harassment, harassment for underage Syrian mothers. A lot of families that I talked to had some family members who were getting married underage in Turkey, which resulted in some forms of harassment. Their husbands were arrested for a couple of days. And so I interpret all of this that Syrian women's bodies are being objectified through medical interventions, through C-sections and birth control. And the Turkish state's history of influence on women's intimate lives has been extended to govern Syrian women as well through anti-natalism. And this is especially interesting because Izmir is the Turkey's 3rd largest city, which is known for espousing secular liberal views and is the kind of base for the opposition party to Erdogan's party. Fears of extraction also came up a good deal. I did the home birth because the doctors at Aegean were students, not doctors. So in Izmir, they sent all of the Syrians to a research hospital, which was training for nurses and medical professionals who were like straight out of high school. And they were treated by those who were doing internships rather than doctors. Plus there were language barriers, right? This was before the translators program was out. At Aegean, the Syrians are afraid to go there because we heard that maybe they are taking the uterus from women after giving birth. The doctors there said that the Syrian people like to have too many children, and they said they shouldn't. Many Syrian women heard this. My relative had a surgery at Aegean, and sometimes they beat her. So she felt that this was representative of how bad the city is. But in fact, this was one hospital. And families who were more middle class, working professionals, could access private health care. And when I interviewed those families, they didn't report any issues at all. So I think that it was more an issue of this particular hospital and the dynamics at work. But this became a very prevalent discourse. And I also heard a lot of stories of families that thought that there had been organ trafficking after a family member had died in the hospital and an autopsy had occurred. They assumed that organ trafficking had occurred. I'm going to move on to gendered impacts and labor. So unregulated labor in the fields of construction and factory work really opens the field for exploitation. As I said, 95% of Syrians would be working in this field. Syrian men often reported being paid half of what their Turkish counterparts made. They have no employment insurance, no time off, and are not covered for work-related injuries. And they also reported narratives of danger at the workplace, including injury and even death. But many others reported never being paid for months of work. So I argue that these indicate that violence is occurring in the context of a neoliberal economy which profits from Syrian displacement. This is from Hussein, who was an electrician in Syria who spoke 4 languages, and he ended up taking up this scrapyard kind of recycling work to support his family of 9 people who lived in a house. And he told me, to feel like you're living outside of society is to feel that there is no And yet we are grateful to Erdogan because otherwise we don't know if we would be alive. We are trying to fit in as many ways as we can, although we feel a lot of discrimination and fear of getting deported if we get into a fight with Turkish men. So a lot of times, especially younger men, would be walking through the neighborhood and a fight would occur with Turkish, young men. And so anytime this kind of bullying or harassment would come up, they were afraid they would just get deported. So due to that fear, we don't go out and we don't visit our friends much in other parts of the city. And I heard this narrative over and over again that Syrians were just kind of in lockdown in their homes and not really going out. And this has gotten worse actually in the last month when Erdogan started deporting people from Istanbul who didn't have official papers. And I'll talk about that. And there were also cases of death in the workplace. This was maybe one of the hardest stories that I heard. But not the only story of death that I heard. My husband, Rajwan, died suddenly of a heart attack at age 53. He passed away from stress, from tiredness, from frustration, because life here is very difficult. Because we are Syrian, they make our lives very difficult. They make us work very hard and don't pay us very much. They overwork us. Rajwan was a mechanical engineer and the owner of a factory in Syria. He did the work of 5 men. He fixed all the machines. He worked from morning to night. When he collapsed, he laid on the ground for 4 hours and they didn't even call an ambulance. The Syrian boy who worked there wanted to take him to the hospital and said, "Boss, I speak Turkish and Arabic. Let me take him to the hospital." The boss said, "If you take one step, I'll hit you." He threatened the boy, and my husband remained on the floor of the factory for 4 hours. Eventually, that Syrian boy called an ambulance, and all the while asked them to pour water on his face to wake him up. Then they took him to the hospital by ambulance. After his death, they didn't even come to offer me any money to compensate for our loss, or even offer us his recent wages. They didn't ask after us or give us anything. So many Syrian men came to Turkey with injuries from the war, but others were injured in the workplace. And the tragedy of the situation is that Syrians are targets of 2 biopolitical regimes, both the war in Syria and this exploitation in Turkey. And it's important to know also that most of the hospitals in and around Aleppo were bombed, and so there wasn't really health care. So a lot of people did come with injuries, only to be exploited by an unregulated labor system, or become disabled or killed in workplace accidents. In Jaskier Puar's book, The Right to Maim, she analyzes injuries and disabilities to make a point about the role of state violence, which maims in the governance of certain populations. I extend this analysis to think about the role of workplace injuries and the government's role in facilitating unregulated labor for Syrians throughout the country. In the case of Syrians in Izmir, the accident makes the ways in which there are so much work and so many bodies available to labor external to the legal system and the regulated labor system. So work that demands physical labor is especially vulnerable to this treatment under the current legal system, which makes value extraction possible and bodies disposable. And I'll talk quickly about dangers of citizenship. So only about 2% of Syrians in Turkey have gained citizenship, and there are many others in the pipeline. And how it works is, for example, if you're a university student, you get called, you get an email or a phone call to apply for citizenship, right? So you can't apply for it unless you're invited to. So it's people with BA degrees and professionals like doctors and lawyers and engineers. So these issues that I'm going to describe only apply to those groups of people. But one of the issues that came up was that if you entered the country before the age of 23, and time has now passed, you have to serve in the Turkish military if you accept citizenship. So here I have this, Syrians become the new Turks, military service awaits them, right? So I did some interviews about how folks felt about that. And Soraya told me, the first disadvantage of Turkish citizenship is if anyone gets Turkish citizenship, they may not get accepted to return to Syria. We read that in the news. We aren't sure yet about Assad's response, but we heard this from everyone on Facebook. My brother is sure about that, very scary. If you get citizenship, you can't return to Syria. If he gets citizenship, he will go to the Turkish army because he's young. He would go to Diyarbakir, Idlib, or Jablus to fight with the Turkish army. It's true, I'm not joking. We heard that people living in Idlib fought in the Turkish army. It's happening. And if anyone saw the news yesterday, Erdogan threatened to unleash the Syrians on Europe if he didn't get his safe zone in northern Syria. So it seems, and if you've read the plans in the last few years for the safe zone, one version that he offered was that it would be like a contained city where refugees could be protected, right? And apparently, potentially governed by Syrians themselves, but under the Turkish military. And Fatima told me with a lot of concern, if I don't want citizenship, will they force me? Or will they refuse it later if I didn't want it now? So a lot of young people were worried that if they refused it, this would have negative impacts for them. The other interesting thing that comes with it is when you go to register for the application process, they ask you if you want to change your name. So my friend, his last name is Abbas. He became Abbas Olu. So you can get creative. But Fatima, refused. She's like, I'm Fatima. I'm not Fatima. I'm not giving up my Eve or anything. But it has advantages in the job market. So if you have a work permit and you have a Turkish name and you speak Turkish, this is your best chance at integrating in the long term and benefiting from the legal status. So some conclusions. The gendered impacts of migration show how heterosexual gender binary structure Syrian participation in the labor market and how anti-natalist discourses negatively portray Syrian reproduction in the public sphere and in healthcare and impacting women. These impacts show us how these forms of care eclipse forms of violence. This is made possible by prevalent anti-Syrian refugee public discourses, as well as the economy of profiteering from Syrian displacement. And in the last few weeks, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of rhetoric in the headlines and news in Turkey, and a lot of articles coming out about the prevalence of this anti-Syrian discourse. So I'm arguing in a sense that it's through forms of care that greater profits are reaped. The cost of aid externalized to the EU by securing EU borders. And it's not just that the EU is giving Turkey 7 billion euros to keep Syrians within its borders, but also that all these funding projects for other forms of aid, right, are coming through the EU. So I think it needs to be problematized a little bit when you're restricting people's migration. And Syrian narratives of danger open up attention to forms of violence which are proving to be normalized in the areas of labor and healthcare, and occupy governance in a context of neoliberal capitalism on the borders of Europe. And as many migration and humanitarian scholars such as Fassi, Tickton, and Feldman have noted, the moral and political project of humanitarianism is suspect, right? So the Turkey-EU deal is a good example of a hierarchy of humanity revealed through the zealous guarding of the global north. And the lack of any rights for refugees in Turkey or access to work permits for most people is an example of a hierarchy of humanity domestically in Turkey across class lines. And as I argued, narratives of danger have penetrated recent social memory for Syrians in Turkey. They also coalesce into mistrust of the public and of neighbors, and understandings of Turks as racist rather than understanding how these policies structure their lives. And Syrian women complained of different forms of violence, such as C-sections and forced extraction. And it's interesting how Syrian neighbors have inverted the pro-natalism of Erdogan. Instead of saying everyone should have at least 3, it's 3 is enough. And Syrians interpret this as affirming the bias that they perceive. And I want to add that there are these narratives of danger about Syrians themselves that are circulating in the Turkish media over the last few years. So there's been a couple of high-profile events. Syrians were recently banned from the beach in Antalya by the JHP, Republican People's Party, the opposition party, but then later it was overturned by another JHP representative. So there's also been cases where the Syrians have been lynched by crowds for being accused of looking at Turkish women at the beach. And there's been cases where Syrian women have been the targets of violence as well. So there's these imaginaries of danger that characterize Syrians as these kind of over-sexual, over-fertile, dangerous migrants. And as I mentioned, recently, high numbers of people were deported from Istanbul by Erdogan's most recent policy in an effort to depopulate Istanbul from so many refugees. And so anyone who entered the country without papers, which can mean a lot of things, was deported. And so people right now are basically hiding in their homes and reporting that everything is very ambiguous. And it's not hard to enter the country without papers, because if you wanted to leave and go home for Eid, but keep your status, you may have had to leave with a smuggler and come back with a smuggler. Or you may have been forced to sign papers saying that you agree to leave voluntarily and find a way to come back another way. Finally, solidarity. So along with these protests against refugees, there have been protests against racism in Turkey. So this slogan recently became popular, Hepimiz Göçmeniz, Irkçılığa hayır, which means we are all migrants, no to racism. So I argue that more solidarity is needed, and further research is needed to understand the political impacts of different forms of governance and the impacts on Syrian refugees, and especially how it works in gendered ways through their lives. Thank you very much.